So this is the last in the 5 Ways to Wellbeing series. I say series, it's basically been me either writing or talking about the different elements of the NHS's 5 Ways to Wellbeing. And these collectively, or even if you tackle them individually, have been shown to improve your well-being or your mental well-being. But then, of course, there's also a knock-on effect onto your physical well-being as well. But all in all, if you've been thinking, I want to improve how I'm feeling, not really sure what to do, how to go about it, then this guide is basically a surefire way of at least getting started because it looks at different areas of your life and different places where you could make a change. But anyway, back onto this one, and the fifth one is about taking notice. And another way of looking at that might be about being present in your environment, what's going on around you, and actually feeling it rather than just being on autopilot, which many of us tend to do out of habit, familiarity, or whatever reason. So let's have a look at how we can maybe be a bit more present and the benefits that we can get from that for our well-being. So when I say take notice, I mean take notice of what your surroundings are and what your environment is and where and when you are at the time as well. Now, a lot of the time we spend our lives on autopilot, and it's true because we could be, have you ever been walking to the shop or driving to work or wherever and suddenly realised that although you've reached it to your destination safely, and of course, when you are driving or you are walking, we are being mindful of what's going on around us, but we can't really remember much about the journey or how we got there or anything that we saw on the way. It's because we're so focused on getting from A to B without taking notice of everything that's going on around us within that time. So that's why taking notice and actually being and actually living and being present actually is probably the term that I'm looking for most, can be really impactful for our well-being in a positive way. And so it's about paying attention to the journey that you're making. What are you noticing? What are you seeing? How are your feelings? But also not having any judgments on what it is that you're experiencing, but being open to experiencing things with a clear mind, almost as if you were like, I don't know, like an alien species from another planet coming to visit and experience Earth with that childlike curiosity, which is probably a much more friendly way of saying it rather than comparing everyone that's listening to this to being an alien. But I'm sure you get the point as well. It's about that newness. And again, as I say, that not having expectations and that non-judgmentalness. Because if we're focusing on our surroundings now, then we're focusing on the present. We're not being judgmental or worrying about things that have happened, and we're not being worried or anxious about things that are yet to happen or haven't happened or probably won't ever happen in the first place. So taking notice of our surroundings, what's going on around us, being present will do absolute wonders for our well-being. And we're going to have a look a little bit further about what we mean by this and how we can do this. So all this talk then about, being in the moment and taking notice and the impact that it has on our well-being is really talking about mindfulness. And mindfulness is a term that a lot of people have heard of and are quite familiar with, but you might not be sure exactly what that means or what it entails. So I'm going to give you a brief overview about that. But the main principle of mindfulness is it's about being in the here and in the now, and in other words, fully attending to what's happening in this moment. It's about being present, but without feeling overwhelmed, because when we think about things that have happened or things that haven't yet happened, in other words, if you think about it, things that we don't have control over, it can make us feel quite anxious. Whereas if we're focusing on what's happening at the moment, then we're not worrying about those things because we're not thinking about them. Another thing about mindfulness is it's a quality that everybody has, but we all have it or practice it at different levels. It might be that you're someone who already is quite mindful and you already are conscious of being present and being in the moment. Or it might be that although mindfulness is something that you've heard of, you're not really sure how to cultivate that. But there are ways that everyone can do so. And one of them being meditation, because although mindfulness and meditation, well, the meditation isn't the be all and end all, but it's certainly a really big and a really important part of it. And it can help that being in the moment, being relaxed, feeling good. Another way might be to insert like deliberate pauses into different aspects of your day, which again we can think about times when that might be appropriate in a short while. Or it might even be merging both meditation with sports or with activities such as yoga. I mean, with mindfulness as well, about that being present, about not worrying about what's happening or about what's going to happen. Some people are like this anyway, and they might not even realize it, or they might not even refer to themselves as being particularly mindful, but it's something that some people do have and show already. But everyone's got the ability to do this and to achieve this. And we can think about some ways now about how we can do that. Now, one of the ways to taking notice I mentioned a few minutes ago is about this idea of being curious. Imagine that you're experiencing some of the following things for the first time and engaging all your senses, like what things smell like, taste like, the texture, any sounds or any feelings as well that they evoke. I imagine if you were trying pizza for the first time or getting wrapped up in a warm, cozy blanket. Again, how that feels on your body. If you're hearing some music, whether it's something that you've listened to over and over again, it's your favourite song, or it could be a completely new piece of music. What's that like to experience? If you're walking your dog, or going for a walk without the dog, either way, about if you take a familiar route, are there things on there that you've not noticed or not really paid attention to? Are there any interesting buildings that you pass or any trees that have interesting shapes, colours or textures? They're just a couple of things that I can think of off the top of my head, but again, another idea to explore. What about smells? Again, an obvious one that came to mind was a scented candle. But also shower gels, things like that. How do those smells make you feel in that moment? And again, looking back to nature, if you have a look at a flower, that's a really good way to practice being mindful because you can very gently feel it, see how delicate it is, and look at the colours. Again, the scent comes into it and the shape of the plant or bush as well. But that could be for any item in nature. But that's this whole idea about being curious, about being childlike and experiencing things without judgment. Now, this idea of accepting things without judgment can be the tricky part because it's accepting our thoughts and feelings as they arise, but without putting any value judgments on them or even evaluating what those feelings mean. So it's about being present in the moment, but without having any value judgments or evaluating what we're feeling. And this is a bit sometimes that people might struggle with, but the thing is with practice, and if we keep trying, then the more we'll improve with that. And so now we've looked at what we mean by being mindful, what we mean by being curious, and also with non-judgmental. Let's think of a few ways in which we could actually take notice and be more mindful. So, in what practical ways can we take notice or be mindful? Now, these are just a few ideas to get you started, but the first one is journaling. So, now if you're in a public place, then I would advise doing this discreetly, and it might even work better on a phone rather than with a notebook and pen, or somewhere out at a local park or somewhere in nature, or even in your own garden. But if you're just observing what's going on around you, the sights, smells, any textures, what you can hear, how you're feeling, and write that down so that you're used to invoking your senses to be in that moment. Now, on the one hand, you could argue, well, hold on a moment. Isn't that quite counterproductive? If I'm meant to be in the moment, I'm meant to be mindful right now, but instead I'm using my attention to write things down in the journal. But the point is, it's getting into that habit and building up that practice of being there and observing what's happening there and then. And I'll always advocate journaling because it has so many uses, but this is just one way of doing it as well. And what about feeling objects? Are you quite a tactile person? And for me, something I've always had a bit of an interest in has been crystals or gemstones. Now, texture-wise, I prefer them when they're in their rough rather than their polished form, and the same as stones or pebbles that you might find on the beach. But I also like looking at the colours and holding them up to the light and noting if they changed in any way. Or I'm not particularly green-fingered, but I do like looking at the plants in my garden, the ones that I've grown myself, especially when they're flowering, because I like to admire the shape, the colour, if they've got a scent, and if I'm being really, really gentle as well, just touching the texture of the leaves and noting how perfectly formed they are. Or you might not have a garden, or you might be out and about, and even noticing things like weeds growing in the cracks of concrete in urban spaces. That's another way of being mindful of being in that moment and really noticing that life that's growing there as well. Another practical way in which we can be in that moment and being mindful is by practicing active listening. So one way of describing active listening is when somebody's talking to us or communicating with us, we're actually trying to understand what they're communicating to us rather than waiting for our turn to speak. And for that, we're making sure that all of our attention is on that other person and the message that they're giving to us there and then. So that could also be a way of being mindful. And then we've got mindful breathing. And this is quite a nice little technique as well that can actually be quite helpful if we are feeling a little bit overwhelmed and just want to come back to the present moment. And that's literally paying all your attention to your breath, just as you're breathing in and out. Now, the point of this is you're not trying to change your breath, you're not trying to make it any faster or any slower. You're just observing what it's doing in that moment. Are you breathing through your nose or through your mouth? Are you breathing quickly, slowly? What does the temperature of your breath feel like? Does it change as you breathe in or out? But it's just bringing that attention back to your breath. And if you want any further information about being mindful, mindful.org is a really, really useful website that's got lots of free resources on that can help you to either get started or to take the next steps in your mindfulness or taking notice journey. Now, this was the last video in my 5 Ways to Wellbeing series. So altogether we covered social connections, being physically active, learning new skills, giving, and taking notice. So why not use this opportunity to create your own wellbeing plan? Do just one thing from each of those areas, or even just pick one that you want to work on. Because if you keep doing that consistently, then you'll notice a positive difference in your own well-being. And if you want any help or any support doing that, or want me to go into anything in further detail, then absolutely get in touch. And remember that nothing changes if nothing changes. You've got to consciously make that change in order to see the difference happen. So that brings us to the end of this final video within this series. I hope that it's been helpful in one way or another. These are the links to my various social media channels or ways of getting in touch if you want to. But meanwhile, thank you for listening and I wish you all the best. Take care.